Hey everyone, welcome in to our epic cram session. I'm Emily, this is Anti-Social Studies. And today it's just going to be sort of an ask me anything. I will do my best to structure this so it's like a little bit chronological, but at some point it's just going to devolve into chaos, and that's okay. So I've been jotting down some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Keep in mind, I'm going to try to divide this up. So I'll say like, hey, okay, first I'm going to go over any questions for this era. And so try to keep, like, you'll have time, basically. I'll go over all four of the main eras, and we'll also talk about testing strategy. I saw a lot of good questions about multiple choice and sourcing documents and what your essays can look like and all that good stuff. So just keep in mind that, like, I'm going to go, when we get to the content part, I'm going to talk about like test strategy first, because we haven't really done one of those on the lives. And then when we get to the content part, just know I'm going to go kind of chronologically so we don't all go insane. So if you have a question about like the proxy wars of the 20th century, we're going to get there. I promise. You don't have to keep throwing it in the chat every 5 seconds. Like, I'll talk about it when we get to the 20th century, if that makes sense. Okay. First of all, thank you for being here, especially those of you who have maybe been with me live this entire time. Make sure that you like this video and subscribe. It helps me out. That would be great. Okay. So with that in mind, what I want to talk about first is just make sure that we're all really clear. Hold on, I got to get like all my screens straight. Okay. Make sure that we're really clear on what the test is just going to look like. So let me go down to this first. It's like super simplistic, but I do just want to make sure that we're really clear on the exam. So if you have questions about the like format of the exam, now is a great time to ask them. Basically, when you walk in on Thursday, whether you're taking it on paper or digitally, you're going to walk in when the test starts. The first section you'll get is the multiple choice. You won't be able to do any other sections. You can't, even if you're done early, you can't move ahead. I mean, you can't go back later. Now, within the multiple choice, you can go back and forth. You can go through all the questions. You can go back and look at ones, even if you're taking the digital exam. I know during the weird COVID 2020 exams, it kind of sucked because on the multiple choice, you couldn't. Like, once you submitted your answer for question 1, you had to move forward and you couldn't go back, and it was awful. They don't do that anymore. So whether you're taking the digital exam or the paper exam, you can move around within the multiple choice section. And that's the strategy I would suggest. My strategy for multiple choice broadly is think about its quantity over quality. What that means is you have 55 multiple choice questions, and effectively each of them are worth 1 point. Just think of it this way, right? I mean, it's not like a harder multiple choice question gives you more points, right? And so if you get 40 questions right, it doesn't matter which 40 questions you get right. So what I mean by that is that it is in your best interest to, if you get to a question that you're like, whoa, this is gonna take me a second to figure out what they're even asking, skip it. Like, mark it on your paper, or hopefully on the digital exam you can mark it. You could definitely have some scratch paper and just write the question number, and then go through and try to like grab all of the easier points. There's not going to be a ton of questions that you feel like are just like a slam dunk, right? But there will be questions that you're like, I can make a pretty good guess on this one. Do those educated guesses, get through all 55 so that you've gone through and grabbed up kind of the easier points to get. Then with at least 10 minutes left or something, go back to the ones you skipped, and look at those. Don't overthink the ones that come kind of easily to you. It's so funny to me. Every year my students will tell me that they kept second guessing themselves because it felt too easy. Like, if there was a question that felt kind of easy, they started getting freaked out. Don't get freaked out. That just means maybe it's an easier question. Remember, some of the questions are easier and some are harder. So don't overthink the ones that come a little bit more easily to you. And if you get to one that's going to take you too much time to think about it at all, skip it on the first go around, and then make sure you come back and just put in an educated guess, right? Grab up all the points that you can. Okay, I'm going to scroll through and look at I'm going to look kind of just at multiple choice questions right now. So if you have a question on the DBQ, just like pause. I'm going to do some math. So what's considered a good score on the multiple choice section? That's a really good question. All across the entire test, here's what you're kind of shooting for. Let me just write it on here so I don't just have to keep. So essentially what you're shooting for is for a 3 on the AP exam. you're shooting for like 65%. And I'll explain what this means in a second. If you want a 4, you're shooting for like 75%. If you want a 5, you're shooting for kind of like, let's say 85%. So what that means is on any given section, let's say your goal is to pass with a 3. On any given section, you just want to get 65% of the available points. So with the multiple choice, what that means is if you, now it's not a perfect formula because obviously you could do really well on one section and then really terribly on another, and they have to figure that out, but this is just generally speaking. So let's say you want to just pass with a 3. Getting like 35 multiple choice out of the 55 would be good. I want you to think about that. It means you could miss 20 questions. If you get the other 35 right, you're doing okay, right? So again, there are going to be questions that you just don't know, and you're going to have to just make a guess and move on. The worst thing you can do is get stuck on a really hard question and run out of time, right? Because you don't need, like, you could almost 20 questions that are too hard for you. You can just make an educated guess and never think about it again, and you'll be okay. Going up from there, right? If you're wanting maybe to get a 4, we're trying to get maybe like 40, 41 multiple choice questions, right? So again, you can miss 15 or so. And then same if you're really like, for your ego, you're like, I want a 5, which good for you. You're shooting for like 46 or 47, right? So again, you can still miss, oh gosh, math. You can still miss like 7 or 8 questions and be in line to get a 5. That's assuming that you do similarly well on the other parts of the exam. So that goes too for like a good score on the DBQ, right? Out of 7 points, it's like, okay, we want to get, what's 65% of 7? If we're getting like a 4 or a 5 on the DBQ, we're doing really well. So again, just remember that this exam on Thursday, no one's ever going to see it. No one's ever going to read your essays beyond the graders. You will never see them again. This is not going to be your best work, right? This is a strategic thing on the exam on Thursday, right? Like, obviously, I want you to just become like a brilliant writer, and I want you to really truly understand the material, but you've worked too hard this year to like throw it away on Thursday. Thursday is about strategery, right? Which I'm making up as a word. And so what that means is like, screw the complexity point. So just don't even worry about it. Screw it. Like, I will barely talk about it today. I will talk about it a little bit because I know everyone wants to know about it. Same thing on the multiple choice. If you get stuck on question 3, don't like grind it out and spend 5 minutes on question 3. You might have 5 questions later on that are going to be way easier, right? So that's generally the strategy. Okay. Let's see. Okay, good. Sorry, I just panicked. I saw someone say their screen is black. Hopefully. Okay. Can you write on the multiple choice? Yes, on the paper exam, totally. You can mark it up, whatever. You can't bring in a highlighter on the paper exam, so you're going to be doing it with your pen or pencil. But yes, on the digital exam, it's a little funkier. On the digital exam, I've been hearing from APUSH kids that there are like digital annotation tools, but those are always a little bit clunky. So in theory, you could like highlight on the digital. But I have been hearing from some students that took the digital exams last week that it's like a little bit harder for like annotation purposes. So, okay, let's see. I have a hard time with time, how to shorten it. Are the multiple choice in chronological order? Yes, the multiple choice are going to be in chronological order. Thank the Lord. Well, I guess I've never confirmed this, but I've said this for years and no one has ever told me actually, in fact, they weren't. My understanding is that the multiple choice go in order. So the first questions will be like in the 1200s, and then the last questions will be in the 20th century. So again, it doesn't go from like easy to hard or hard to easy. They're all kind of mixed in there. So your job on Thursday is to go find all the like easy to medium questions first and make sure you get those. Okay. This live is going to be longer. This live is going to be 2 hours, assuming people stick around and have questions, obviously. And this will be recorded and saved. So I understand you might not be able to sit here and watch this whole thing for 2 hours straight, although if you're with me, let's do it. But I'll save it on my channel as well. Okay, so this is like an Ask Me Anything review. It's literally just like, we're going to go through, right now we're talking about the test. Next, we're going to talk about writing strategy, and then we're going to just jump into context. Okay, can you go between the multiple choice and the SAQ? No, you cannot. So I want to clarify something, because And again, we're talking about the multiple choice and the SAQ. So have your questions be on those sections. If you have questions on other sections or content, just hold on to them for now, okay? Once you have the multiple choice, that's the only section you can work on. So I'm going to draw a little line here. There's like a hard line that's like, these are divided, right? And so what that means is when your 55 minutes are up, you're going to turn in the multiple choice section and you will never see it again, or on the digital, you'll submit it, right? If your strategy in class tests has been to use the multiple choice to help you with the writing, just know that's not going to be an option on Thursday. What I mean by that is that I know some students who, if they're like trying to think of evidence for their LEQ, they'll go back to the multiple choice and be like, oh, I could use this document and what they said in here. Obviously, if you just remember it, that's great, but you will not have access to the multiple choice document. That will be gone. So just keep that in mind. Okay. And as far as time on the multiple choice, and then I'll move into the SAQ and the essays. As far as time on the multiple choice, the only thing I can tell you is I would not read the stimulus first. What I would do with multiple choice, and I have a whole YouTube video on multiple choice strategy here on this channel. I recommend you read the source information 100%, where it'll be like, this is a painting of blah, 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 or whatever. Because that sometimes can be very helpful. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes it really is. I would read the source information word for word. Then I would read the first question. Figure out like, what am I looking for? Because it might be that you're looking for something very specific. And what happens to students is that if you start reading the stimulus first, you get bogged down in every single word because you think you need to know everything about the document before you can answer the questions, and you don't, right? We've all taken these multiple choice tests and realized that for some of these questions, like they might be asking you about one specific sentence and just understanding what's going on in that one specific sentence. Sometimes you can answer the question without reading the document at all. Of course, you will eventually need to read it for one of them. But my point is the best thing you can do to speed yourself up is just read the source information word for word to be like, okay, this is a diary from Marie Antoinette or whatever, and then go read the question, then go back to the document. And what you're doing is you're basically hunting for clues. Don't think of it as reading to fully understand. Think of it as hunting for clues. That's also my strategy on the DBQ, by the way. It's like, look at the prompt, think through the prompt, then go and like hunt for clues in the documents. You don't need to understand the whole thing to get something useful out of it. Okay. How should we review wrong answers that you do in practice tests? Oh, I don't know if that's with your teacher. I don't know if they're using like AP Classroom or whatever. So this week might be one to, if you want to ask your teacher, if you can go look at your old tests. I'll be honest, I don't think reviewing wrong answers on multiple choice is a really effective way to prepare, because that's just going to help you with that one question that you'll never see again, right? I would instead try to answering new questions, or just try doing like big picture review. Okay. If you have okay, Celine, this is my favorite question. If you have no idea what the answer is, what letter should you choose? I'm going to give you my best tip. Okay. So the multiple choice strategy goes, once you've read and skimmed the document and whatever, obviously first, if there is a just obvious answer, then pick it and move on. This strategy is only if you're looking and there's not one that, and by obvious, I mean, you feel like 80% good about it. You're like, I'm 80% sure it's D. Then just pick D and move on. Don't ever think about it again. Honestly, you're probably right. If you look and you're not sure which one it is, step one is always eliminate. There's gonna be at least one or two kind of obviously wrong answers. And by wrong, I mean either it just didn't happen. It's just not a thing. Like it's not a factual statement. So remember, this is almost like your first step is almost true or false. If it just says a thing that didn't happen, right? If one of the answer choices is like, I don't know, the, Song China like expanded up to the north beyond the Great Wall. And you're like, yeah, that didn't happen. Then it cannot be right. It's amazing how many students will pick that if they think it fits, even if their brain is telling them, but that thing didn't happen. They're like, but it makes sense for the question. Or obviously something's wrong if it could be a correct statement, but it doesn't have to do with the prompt. So first step is eliminate, because if you can get yourself down to 2, remember, we only really need to get like 60 to 70% of these questions right. So the best thing is if you can narrow it down to 2, you're putting yourself in a really good position to where even if you're straight guessing, you're going to get close to where you need to go, right? Now, if you have, like, let's say you're down to 2 and you're like, I still just don't know. You're 50-50. Then first think about the document they gave you and think if one makes more sense connected to that document. So if they give you a document that's like a diary from a woman, and then one of the answer choices is about gender and the other one's about economics, just maybe pick the gender one, because why would they give you this woman's diary, right? Finally, don't just pick a random letter. Instead, if you just need to guess, you're like, I gotta move on, pick the vaguest answer left. I'll say that again. Pick the vaguest answer left. So what that means is, let's say you have two answer choices left, and one says, the Mongol Empire rapidly expanded across all of Asia. That's a really specific statement. Rapidly expanded across all of it, that's really specific. Whereas if instead there's another answer choice that's like, cultural diffusion occurred across trade routes, that's like a really general, vague statement. It's less likely to be wrong if it's vague. So instead of just going, I'm going to pick B and just do all B, if you're down and it's like you're desperate, just pick the answer choice that's the most vague. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on for multiple choice for now, just because it's the part of the exam I can help you with the least, because we just don't know what the multiple choice are going to look like. I can help you way more in this live, helping you with writing and helping you with content. Wait, I'm looking. You just said to see quantity over quality. Yes, on the multiple choice. So the idea, right, is that like you want to answer every single question. You should make sure you answer all 55 questions, even if there's a few that you have to go a little quickly through. So let's say that you get a question and you're like, I can figure this out, but it's going to take me 5 minutes. Don't. Mark it. If you have time, get through everything, have an answer for everything. Then if you have time, go back and figure it out. But the point is, a lot of students will get hung up early in the exam and be like, I'm going to figure each one out. And then they run out of time before they even get a chance to see some of the last questions. Cool. Okay. SAQ. And what we can do for this one is we can actually look at the SAQ from last year. The College Board doesn't release any of the multiple choice questions, which is super annoying. And I wish that they would, but they don't. But they do every year release the free response questions. So if your teacher hasn't ever, given you something like this, so you've never actually seen what the test is going to look like, you can literally just go Google AP World 2022 exam, and it is a PDF. You can open it, right? Okay. For the short answer question, this is what they're going to look like. There's going to be a ton of writing here that you can just sort of ignore. This is basically, it's assuming like no one has ever explained to you what a short answer question is at all. You can just kind of ignore it, right? You're going to jump down to like the passage. Okay, so just so we're clear on format, you're going to have the SAQ number 1, you have to answer. And it's going to be a secondary source. What that means is it's going to be a historian or a textbook or something talking about a thing from the past. And this is a really common type of question, is asking something like, hey, once you've identified the historian's argument, what's a piece of evidence that could further support his argument? What's a piece of evidence that could challenge his argument? So just be aware that that's a type of question they might ask you. They might give you a historian talking about how the French Revolution was not as radical as people think. Let's say. And they might say like, identify one piece of evidence that would challenge that argument. And you could be like, have you heard of the guillotine, right? Or whatever. I mean, you'd write it out. Okay, so question 1 is going to be, you have to answer it. It's a secondary source, meaning a historic, like looking back. Question number 2, you have to answer it, and it's going to be a primary source. So this could be a visual, like this is a map of the Canton trading like warehouses and stuff in the 1850s in China, or it could just be a primary source document, text, whatever. Okay, we have no idea what the questions are going to be for this because it just depends on what the stimulus is. The last part, you get a choice. So you have 2 just pure SAQs, no document at all. It's just like, tell me these things, right? And you get to pick one or the other. So you either have to pick all of 3 or all of 4. So you can't be like, I'm going to do 3A and 3B, and then I'm going to do 4C. No. You have to pick all. So for this one, think about this choice for like at least a minute before you choose. Because what happens is students sometimes will, let's say we skim through these. Let's say these were your two choices on Thursday. Here's what a lot of students did, frankly, or would do. They're like, Columbian Exchange. I don't remember anything about the Columbian Exchange. And then they're like, Green Revolution. Well, let's do the opposite. Let's say they look at Green Revolution and they just go, oh my gosh, I don't really know that much about the Green Revolution. And so you just automatically go with question 3. But like you might actually, these questions down here might actually be easier. What you want to think about is you want to take like 1 minute to try to think through how many of these little prompts do you have a piece of evidence for? Because that's all you need. You just need like one specific thing you can talk about. And so you might find that you have like a good piece of evidence here, but not here and not here. And that you're surprised. You're like, actually, I have pretty good evidence for these two. And so you should pick this one, right? It's a numbers game. Again, quantity over quality. Like you want to make sure that you have an answer for every single one. Okay. Again, these are the SAQ prompts where there's no document. These are the closest the exam gets to just kind of memorization. Like, hey, just tell me this thing. So let's talk about what an SAQ should look like, and we'll just use this as practice. And I'm going to do the Green Revolution one because that is a term that comes up a lot in the exam that students don't always know. So it's in the 20th century. Green Revolution is basically using technology and science to basically make crops grow better to feed the growing population. So genetically modified organisms, pesticides, all that sort of stuff. Okay. So let's say there's one verb you need to really pay attention to, and then all the others you can treat the same. Identify. If you just see, if the question just says identify, these are the easiest ones. Do not overthink them. Again, quantity over quality. Get a simple answer down so that you can spend more time on the explains. So not every answer is going to be the equal length. If it's just identify, that one's going to be like 1 sentence, maybe 2. So what it was going to look like is if you're doing the paper exam, you're going to have one sheet of like lined paper with a big box around it. And that's where you can answer like question 4. So you basically have like the equivalent of 1 page to answer A, B, and C. You'll do that for each of them, right? So that's really your only limitation. On the digital, I think there's just a certain number of lines that you can type or whatever. So let's say what you would do on your piece of paper is you would literally just write A. Don't be cute about it. Do not weave these answers together. Do not try to make the different answers connect to each other. This again is like strategy. This is like caveman speak. Like you are not writing an essay here. You are literally just like saying the answer as quickly as possible. So it says identify one scientific or technological development that contributes to the Green Revolution. You can literally say one was the use of pesticides to keep plants healthy. Done. And then you move on. If it says identify, that's all you need to do. So you're saying pesticides, and I'm like literally explaining it enough that the grader kind of knows I know what I'm talking about. Honestly, if I just said one was pesticides, they probably would give you credit for that. But like, it is good to make sure that like, it's kind of clear to the reader that you like kind of know what pesticides are, which clearly I kind of don't because I was like to keep plants healthy, right? So keep that in mind. You do not need to, sorry, something weird happened. Okay. You do not need to rephrase the question. Notice I didn't say one scientific or technological development that contributed to the Green Revolution was time. Time is of the essence in the SAQ. You can literally say one was. They know the question you're responding to, especially if you put A next to it. Okay. Then we leave ourselves more time for B and C that are going to take more time. Because now it's explain. Literally any other verb besides identify, you just treat it the same. And the strategy that I've used, which is if you follow Heimler's, it's the same. It's just a different. I use answer, prove, and explain. 8. It's the same as Heimler's. Heimler's is like T, thesis, evidence, analysis, or something like that. So you want to just answer with a specific piece of like proof, and then you just want to make sure you explain how that proof works, basically. So explain one way in which the Green Revolution benefited populations in the developing world. Okay, there's a pretty obvious one, which is like food. Food was good, right? one benefit was an increase in available, oh my gosh, food. Okay, that's my answer. Great. Now I just need to provide something kind of specific and explain it to like prove that that answer is right. So what I might say is, by genetically modifying certain crops so that they could grow bigger and more quickly. That's my specific thing. Notice I don't have to like name a specific GMO or something. Just the idea of GMOs is a specific thing. That's something I know. So by genetically modifying certain crops so that they could grow bigger and more quickly, the developing world could feed more people and prevent starvation. Okay. And you might go like, am I done? How many sentences do I need? It doesn't matter. Like, they have to be incomplete sentences. Instead of going, how many sentences do I need? You should instead think about, have I aped it? Do I have an answer? Yes, increase in available food. Do I have something specific? Yes, I say genetically modifying crops to grow bigger. That's specific proof. And is it explained? Yeah, they can feed people. Great, then I'm done. That one only took 2 sentences. Another one might take 4 sentences, right? It just depends. Okay. Then we go down to the last one. Explain one way in which the Green Revolution affected the environment within the developing world. Do I know an answer to this question? That it affected the environment? I mean, pesticides, right? Those aren't great. So one effect was increased, not pollution, was the increase of toxic materials from pesticides. And then I would go on to explain, right? They're like, okay, well, because there's these toxic materials that kill certain types of pests and whatever, they can also sometimes harm like ecosystems and blah, blah, blah. And I would explain it, right? So now I'm going to clear this and I want to look at your questions in the chat. So, yes, is this similar to TEA? Yes, it's the same. It's like, it's basically just answer, prove it, explain, however you want to think about it, right? And the other point too is that think of it as a checklist. It's not sentence 1, sentence 2, sentence 3. So if you use Heimler's, it's like, what is it? Thesis, evidence, analysis. That doesn't mean sentence 1 is your thesis, sentence 2 is your evidence, sentence 3 is your analysis. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Notice I did it all in 2 sentences. So just write naturally. These do not need to be well written. They can be really short, choppy sentences. That's fine. They just have to be complete sentences. Okay. What if you don't know what to put for the SAQ at all? Okay. So the biggest concern would be if that happened here, because you don't have any document to support you. So hopefully that's why they give you 2 choices. Honestly, if you can figure out 2 of the 3 answers, then you're probably okay. Again, you don't need to get every single answer correct. You want to put a guess, literally just make something, like try, right? But if you feel pretty, like if you're deciding which one to answer and you're like, I feel like I have 2 of the 3 I feel pretty good about, great. Again, quantity over quality, right? 2 good answers and then 1 bad one is way better than 1 amazing answer and 2 bad ones, if that makes sense. Now, on these though, let's say, I mean, it's like you can use the document to help you, right? So this one, for example, says, right, this is a plan of the factories. Identify one economic development in this period that led to the situation represented in the map. It's a very vague, that's basically a kind of a context question, like, hey, tell me how we got here. And let's say you look at this and you're like, I have no idea what the Canton factories were. Well, here's a few things. 1, read the source information word for word. They give you most of the information you need, right? So this says plan of factories, parentheses, trading posts and warehouses in the city of Canton in China in the 1850s. This plan was drawn from a survey carried out by the British Royal Navy. That's a lot of information right there. That's a lot of clues that the College Board is giving you of like, here are all the different things you could talk about. So then what you go is, okay, what do I know about like Britain and China and trade? And maybe you get to the Opium Wars, which is what this is kind of getting at. It's like, oh, the Opium Wars and spheres of influence and whatever. But here's the deal. A just says identify one economic development that led to this situation. So even if you're like not sure specifically about what's going on in Canton, but if you can talk about an economic development that led to, I don't know, other countries' navies setting up factories, you could talk about industrialization. Industrialization led to this situation because, right, notice that most of the places that have factories are, Western and kind of European countries who have industrialized. And so, clearly they're spreading out around the world, building their empires, and they need raw materials, blah, blah, blah. Like you can come up with something that's pretty good, even if you're like, I actually don't know this specific document, right? Again, hopefully you do, but if not, it's okay. Same thing up here. If they ask like, let's look at B, because I saw someone was asking about like modifying an argument too. So explain how one piece of evidence would challenge his argument regarding the Mongols in the first chapter of A New Era. So this is another one where reading the questions can help you get through the document more quickly, because now I know what I'm hunting for. I'm hunting for this. I just need to know what is his argument regarding the Mongols in the first chapter of A New Era. So I'm going to kind of like, oh, it's right here. The Mongols' conquests have been defined as the last chapter of the Eurasian transformations. They can also be regarded as the first chapter. Great. The Mongol period was a significant step towards closer integration of the old world, certainly vast dimensions. Okay, so he's just arguing like Pax Mongolica, like the modern world began when the Mongols connected all these trade routes together. Okay. This question is asking, what's one piece of evidence that could challenge his argument? So you just want to make it almost like an algebra question, like Biron's argument, which is X, right? X equals Mongol conquests were first kind of unification of modern world. That's his argument. So now you just need to think of one thing that could prove that that statement is maybe not as true as we think. So it could be that the Mongols weren't modern. So it could be something like, well, like the brutal tactics, or it could just be the fact that the Mongol Empire didn't last very long. It could be like, well, the brutal tactics of the Mongol conquest, like, yes, they did unite the world, but for a very short time. Their empires only lasted for like a century before they all kind of fell apart. And they all eventually ended up assimilating into the places they conquered anyway. So like, actually there's not this big lasting legacy. Of course, I don't think that's true. I agree with this argument, but you're making something up, right? That could also be true. But you could also think about maybe another event that could be the first step in this new era. So instead, this is a good example of if you don't really know much about the Mongols, well, what's one piece of evidence that could challenge regarding the Mongols being the first chapter of a new era? Think about someone else who could be the first chapter of that era. Think about who else could be. You could say, I actually disagree. I think that England signing the Magna Carta in the 1200s is actually the first chapter of this new era because, or, like whatever, right? So again, that's an example of it. At first glance, this seems like a question just all about the Mongols, but it's actually not necessarily, right? And so it's like you have to know some things, but same with like the Canton system. It seems like, oh, I have to know all about Canton. No, you don't. You kind of just need to know about like generally imperialism, industrialization, that sort of thing. Okay, with your questions for the SAQ. Yeah, Canton, you would talk about the spheres of influence. You could talk about the Opium Wars. You could just talk about the rise of the British Empire. There's lots of things, right? Okay. Let me see. Okay, I want to see. There's one or two questions I want to make sure. Okay, I have this question too. Okay, someone. If you answer both 3 and 4, no, don't do that. Yeah, so Ava, pick one. Don't do it. They won't grade this. They'll just grade the first one you answer, and they won't even look at the second one. And you'll run out of time for sure. Okay. Let me see. There was one other question that a few people were saying, yes, I have this question too, from Teresa, and I'm trying to scroll back to see what it was. Okay. Some other good questions. What if I forget the term and just explain it? Totally fine. Totally fine. Like, as long as you explain it to the extent that the grader knows what you're talking about, then you're okay. Do you need TEA or APE for identify? No. For if it just says identify, then you're basically just doing T and E or A and P. You're literally just answering with something specific. You don't have to do the whole explain thing. And then I'm seeing a lot of people that like their teacher is maybe suggesting like always do the full answer no matter what. Okay, maybe. But here's the biggest problem with the SAQ. The biggest problem with the SAQ section is the time. This section goes fast. Every year, students come back and say the hardest part was the SAQ. And they say that mostly because they feel like they ran out of time. So that's why I lump it too in with the multiple choice, where we're talking about quantity over quality. Again, it is not in your best interest. If it says identify one, it is not in your best interest to write a whole paragraph for that identify one. No, you don't need to do that. You can say like, one example is pesticides and move on. And then think about how valuable that time you saved is to get through some that you're going to struggle with. You're going to need more time, whatever. There's no bonus points. Literally, the SAQ is graded. You either get the point or you don't. There's no nuance, right? There's not bonus points. There's not whatever. It's literally just like, did you answer this question? Yes, move on, right? It's not like in the essays where there's like strategies and stuff. You just got to like answer it and move on. So again, what I always tell my students to do, this is more relevant if they're doing the paper exam. So on the day of the test, you're going to essentially get 3 pieces of paper. That's going to be like question 1, question 2, and then like question 3 or 4. So you'll have 3 pieces of paper that are lined, and they'll be like, this is where you answer question 1, so on and so forth. What I suggest to my students is that you go ahead on this piece of paper and you just write like A, B, C, kind of like divide it up a little bit, A, B, C, leave yourself some room at the bottom. And then you think of this like the multiple choice. You're skipping around, trying to answer the easy ones first. The easy, quick ones, get them out of the way. So let's say you are, with this strategy, let's say I look at question 1, and I read it, I understand 1A, I feel really good about. Okay, so I'm going to write my answer to 1A. 1B, I'm like, I have no idea. I skip it for now. I just skip, leave space, and go down to C. Answer it if I can. Then literally, I move to the next one. You're going to go through like basically all 9 and just skip any one that you're like, I don't know yet. I'm going to have to really think about this. Okay, so go through. So then you might be like, okay, cool, I know A, but not B and C. And then maybe you feel really good about the last one. Then you go back to the ones that you're going to struggle on, because again, they're all worth the same point. So think of it this way, like go back down to this one. Let's look at the Columbian Exchange one. Identify one technological development that contributed to the Columbian Exchange. I mean, like that contributed to the Columbian Exchange, lateen sales, gunpowder, the compass, the astrolabe, like whatever, right? That's such a quick question to answer, right? That's worth a point. The same as, let's go down to C, explain one way in which the transfer of crops and or domesticated animals during the Columbian Exchange affected the environment. And it's a full explain question. Those are both worth the same point. So it's in your best interest to go through and get the easier ones first, because again, you don't need to get all of them right. You want to get more than half of them right. So again, if you panic and you're like, I just can't think of a single answer for this one question for, 3A, it's okay if you feel like you have pretty good answers for the other ones. One last thing, frankly, if I was taking this test and I was trying to decide which of these questions I would answer, I would notice that this has 2 identifies and this one only has 1. So I would also notice, like, if everything else is the same, I'd be like, oh, this question's easier because you just have to do identify twice. Those are faster. They're easier. So again, don't make it pretty. Don't write more than you need. You can always go back and add. So let's say you get through all the questions and you still have 5 minutes left. Well, then go back and add and add and add. There's no such thing as too much, right? But it's just time. Time is the only issue. Okay. Any other big questions about the SAQ? Let's see. Heard Heimler talking about AP graders needing explanation even for identify. I don't know. I was a grader, but I didn't grade SAQs, and every training I've been to, they've shown identify questions and been like, yeah, you don't. I mean, what needs to be clear, I'll say it this way. It needs to be clear to the grader that you're not just throwing a random term there and hoping it sticks. So I would write just enough to make it clear to the grader that you know what you're talking about. So instead of going like, for example, the training I was in, there was an SAQ that was about mass violence committed by states in the 20th century. And it said, identify one example. And literally they accepted like one example was the Holocaust. That was it, period. What I tell my students is I say, I would write just enough to make it clear to the grader that you know what that event is that occurred in Germany during World War II against the Jewish people and other groups. Done, and then move on, right? So I think what they don't want is that when they say they need an explanation, I think what they really need is just they need to know that you didn't just throw a random term there and hope it was right, if that makes sense. Okay. Should we leave space on our paper to add info if we have time? Sure. That's why I tell my students just divide it like A, B, C, so then you can skip around really easily and you can keep track of which ones you need to come back to. Okay, I'm going to move on from SAQs for now because we got lots more to do, right? I want to talk about the essays and then I want to we'll get to the content kind of in the second hour. Oh yeah, and so Anisha is asking like, so let's say you just say a bunch of examples, you won't get points off. No, I'm going to say this multiple times throughout this live because it makes me feel so much less stressed on your behalf. At no point in grading this exam can we take points away from you. Never. There is literally no way for us to subtract points. Once you have earned a point, you've earned it and you can't lose it. It really works in your favor. So what that means is, let's look at this Columbian Exchange DBQ again, and let's do the explain one way in which the transfer of crops benefited, affected the environment. Okay. Let's say you go, okay, one effect was the establishment of cash crop plantation agriculture in the New World. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton took over, previously wild or more diverse land, and whole communities were growing. Actually, I should focus on the environment, not on people. Whole ecosystems were destroyed to focus on, whatever, one. Okay, so let's say that was my answer and it's good. And then let's say I go off on a rant about ecosystems. And I'm like, and these ecosystems really shouldn't even be there because ecosystems aren't really even systems. And, if you really think about the Florida swamps are really an ecosystem where they should be growing cactus. And like, literally, if I just go off the deep end and like have a stroke and like write something insane, if I've already earned the point, I've earned the point. They will read it and they'll be like, oh, good God, what is happening to this girl, right? But like they'll read it and they'll just go, no. What they're essentially doing when they're looking at any of your writing is they are just looking for ways to give you points. That's it. So it always benefits you if you have an idea and you're like, I think this might be a good answer, just put it on the page if you have time. Because again, it can't hurt you. If nothing else, they'll just kind of skip over it and be like, no, right? So. Okay, so on that note, let's talk about the essays. And I'm going to talk more about the DBQ just because honestly, if you can do a DBQ, you can do an LEQ. So just to be really clear, this part 2, what's going to happen is you're done with the SAQ. You'll turn it in and you'll get like a 10 or 15 minute break. You'll leave the testing room. You'll all sit there eating your snack in silence, awkwardly, whatever. And then you'll come back in. And this section is different. You're going to get the whole thing at once and you can move around. So in theory, you could write your LEQ first. You could write your DBQ, then go to your LEQ, then go back to your DBQ. But please write your DBQ first. please. The DBQ is way more important than the LEQ. In fact, the LEQ is the least important part of this entire test, and it's the easiest part of this entire test, I promise. Because one, it's worth only 15% of your score. And two, you get a choice of 3 prompts. There is bound to be one prompt that you're like, I could write 2 or 3 paragraphs on this. And that's really all an LEQ is. So I'll show you kind of my outline for the LEQ, but just keep in mind the DBQ is way more important. So if you're going to steal time, I would steal time from the LEQ and give you more time to work on the DBQ. What that means is, what will happen is they'll say, we recommend that you start with the DBQ. We recommend you take 15 minutes of a reading period to skim through the documents and develop your argument. You don't have to listen to that. You can just start writing. You can do whatever you want, right? They'll give you like a little 15-minute, like when the first 15 minutes are up, they'll be like, okay, the reading period is now over. We recommend you start writing your essay. You might have already started. You might have not. If you haven't, that's just a good reminder, like, I got to get going, right? Then at the end of the hour, they'll say, that's been an hour. We recommend you move on to the LEQ. If you're still working on your DBQ, keep working on your DBQ. Basically, you want to make sure you leave yourself, let's say 25 minutes at least for the LEQ. So you can take up to like 15 extra minutes if it means you're going to get more points on the DBQ. Now, if you're done and you're like, I don't know what else to say, and you're just rambling, well, then no, right? Move on to the LEQ. If you have time, then go back and keep rambling. Hope that you say something good, right? Again, on the writing, you're never done. Like, it's going to be exhausting, but like, you should never like sit back and be like, well, I have 15 minutes left, but I'm done with both my essays. Because again, they cannot take points away from you. So like, keep adding more evidence, keep trying hip another document, try to add more, whatever, because worst case, they're like, yeah, you already got the point. But like, the only thing you're losing is just like the feeling in your writing hand, but like, you'll get that back when the test is over, right? Keep writing, keep adding stuff. Okay, so with that, let's look at outlines. Let me do the LEQ first because it's a little bit simpler, but the thing I want, I guess, to emphasize is, and also thank you to the comment section. Y'all are doing a great job of answering each other's questions too, which is really great. Okay, so this is what an LEQ would look like. You're going to have, it's going to be 3 paragraphs. You're going to write 3 paragraphs. That's probably it. Don't overthink this. It's not actually that difficult. And we'll look at some of the examples from last year. I'm not going to write a whole LEQ today. That'd be a lot. Basically, you're going to have an introduction. In that introduction, ideally, you have context and your thesis statement. I've done whole videos on this channel on like, here's what context is with a ton of examples, or here's what a thesis statement is with a ton of examples. So if you really want to deep dive on those, I've literally done them. Just go to my channel and search thesis and you'll see a whole video for it. Then you're going to have your body paragraphs. You really only need 2 body paragraphs for the LEQ. There's not really a benefit to doing 3 unless you have time, right? If you have time, then sure, why not? The strategy in general flips for the long essays to, I always have to think about this, quality over quantity. So like making sure, and what I mean by that is the points you're going for. In the multiple choice in the SAQ, multiple choice is like, please answer all 55 questions. Don't be like, I think I'm good with my 40 and then ignore the last 15. No, answer all the questions. Same with the SAQ. Answer every question, like all 3 of them fully. For the essays, it's way better to think about out of the 6 points in the LEQ, let's shoot for like the 5 that I feel confident in getting, which is why I'm telling you to ignore complexity, because you can't even do complexity. And by that, I mean, you can't force it. Complexity just happens. Complexity just means like the reader sits back and is like, damn, that was a really good essay. And it just means essentially that you did these other things really well. That's really what complexity means. It's like, whoa, their thesis was like a thesis. That was really good. It's like, oh my gosh, their evidence, they had so much evidence and they were connecting it together in really unique ways. So like, ignore complexity. It's not its own separate point. It's something that comes if you've done these other things well. So focus on doing these other things well, right? So again, for the LEQ, we would love to get a 4. If we got a 4 out of 6, that would be great. So that means I would try for a 5, and then maybe you don't get one of the points. What that really means, let's just really oversimplify it here, is that you're doing like a few sentences for your introduction, context, and thesis. And then notice that these body paragraphs are essentially just essay cues. Answer, prove with evidence, and explain. Answer, prove with evidence, and explain. Keep going until you run out of time, right? Don't overthink it. You don't need to have a ton of evidence. You just need to have good quality evidence. Again, quality over quantity. So let's look at the LEQ prompts from last year and kind of just brainstorm what a very simple LEQ would look like. Again, these essays are not going to showcase your writing skills. No one's ever going to see them again, right? Okay. So some people were asking, like, will we get a rubric? Kind of, that's what this is. That's what these bullet points are, is reminding you of the different points. But hopefully you kind of know what you need to do and you can sort of skip past that. So now this is the same like in the SAQ when you get a choice. Don't just pick the prompt that sounds the easiest without thinking about it. So you want to skim through. I think it's totally fine to just look at one and go, hell no. So let's say you see this one, and you're like, before 1500, states in the Americas, pre-Columbian states in the Americas, consolidating and centralizing their authority. And you're like, hell, I don't even know what they're talking about. I can't name a single pre-Columbian state. Fine. But you need to really consider at least 2, is what I'm saying. Now, to be clear, this first essay is talking about the Aztecs and the Inca and like state building. Like, how did they consolidate power? How did they have power? That's what that essay is about. The second one, notice they're from 3 different eras. They will not all be from the 1200s. Probably one will be from the 20th century, which tends to be the most popular one that people choose because it's the freshest in your mind. So prompt 3 says, and notice they do this weird thing that I hate, but they do this weird thing where they give you like a statement and then a prompt. And I hate it. I don't understand why they do this, but I think it's meant to like help get your brain going, but it just confuses people. So in 3, it says, from 1450 to 1750, the global increase in trans-regional contacts led to both expansion and contraction of existing religions, as well as the development of new religious practices. Well, that's like a whole lot of nothing. It's not very helpful. Develop an argument that, this is your prompt. Develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which military conflict or conquest was the main cause of religious change in this period. You're like, oh, interesting. Okay, so people are changing religions in this time period, or religions are expanding or shrinking. How much of that is happening because of like military reasons, war, conquest? Okay, interesting. Maybe you think, I really like that essay prompt. You're like, I'm going to do that one. Just take 1 extra minute and at least look at and consider the other prompt, because there might be a prompt that you like better, but you don't have as much evidence for. There might be a prompt that seems more boring or not as interesting or whatever, but you're like, oh shoot, actually I have a lot of evidence. You want to pick the prompt that you have the most evidence for. That's it, not the one you like the best. So the last one, in the 20th century, spread of free market economic ideas led to changes. Develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which the spread of free market ideas led to economic change in the 20th century. Okay, so a lot of people will just kind of automatically pick the 20th century one because they assume it's the easiest. I don't think that's true. I think question 4 is the hardest. It's just vague and broad. Spread of free market ideas led to economic change. I'm like, what are we even talking about here? I mean, kind of the Cold War, but I don't know. So again, a lot of people just will like, oh, it's the 20th century, I'm going to do that one. Really think about, like, I'm trying to think right now of like what specific evidence I could use for this one, and nothing's really coming to mind. A lot is coming to mind for these 2. So again, don't assume you're going to pick like the most recent prompt. Okay, so let's say we wanted to do evaluate the extent to which military conflict or conquest was the main cause of religious change in this period. Let me just open. No, let me just do it on here. Okay. So let's say, sorry, there's so many different things in my way. I just need to. Okay. All right. So we're evaluating the extent to which military conflict or conquest led to religious change, question mark. 1450 to 1750. I'm not going to write this whole thing. I'm just going to show you, like, it's really, really simple. I would go through and I would think of my body paragraphs first. So I want to set myself in this era and be like, okay, we're talking about the 1492, the age of exploration. Oh, the new world, bringing Christianity to the new world. That's conquest. Okay. So you're going to go conquest is going to be converting new world to mostly Catholicism is going to be one piece of evidence. And then you're like, this is also gunpowder empires. So it could also be Ottoman Safavid wars, Sunni Shia, right? Between the gunpowder empires. And then you might go, oh, this is also Europe and like the Protestant Reformation. So you can go like the religious wars of Europe, Protestant Catholic, which by the way, people have been asking me a lot about like the 30 Years' War and the whatever years war and whatever. The only one I would really, the 30 Years' War is helpful because it's a religious war. It's like, that's what this is. In the Holy Roman Empire, all the different princes and stuff were basically fighting over whether they were going to be Catholic or Protestant. And that was basically it, right? And so all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, I have a lot of good evidence for this. And let's say you can't think of counter evidence. Don't you worry about it. Literally just write this simple essay. Literally be like, the vast majority of religious change between 1450 and 1750 occurred because of military conflict and conquest. Boom. That's my thesis. It's simple. I don't have a counter argument. It's fine. You don't need a counter argument. You do not need a counter argument. The only reason why a counter argument is helpful is for complexity. But genuinely, and so like if you can think of a counter argument and it comes to you, then do it. But if not, just start writing that super simple basic B essay. Just like write it, have it be simple. It doesn't have to be the thing you believe in your heart to be true. It's just the thing you have the most evidence for. And then all of a sudden, guess what? I'm just going to have a paragraph maybe talking about Spanish conquest, the kind of requerimiento that they would read to everyone being like, hello, this is our land now. And you're all Christians, by the way, right? You would talk about, missionaries and like Jesuits, etc. A paragraph about that. And then maybe you do a paragraph about wars back in Europe and the Middle East. And then you're done. So you're like, so boom, I proved it. Religious change came because of military conflict and conquest. And guess what? If you do that and you do it well, you're getting yourself at least a 3, probably a 4 for that simple essay. You have a simple thesis, 1 point. You have a topic sentence where you're like, the conquest of the New World is a great example of religious change coming from violence. And then you include relevant facts. You talk about Spanish conquistadors, the fact that they brought priests with them when they were exploring because they knew one of their main goals was to convert people. And also like the Spanish crown was backed by the Pope because the Pope explicitly wanted to find new populations to convert. And they forced everyone to convert even if they didn't speak the language and didn't really understand what they were agreeing to, right? That's amazing evidence. And as long as you're using reasoning, and that's where you get like the causation, change over time. You can use whatever you want. Evaluate the extent to which is the nicest prompt they can give you because it's letting you choose your own adventure. You get to choose how you're going to make this argument. You can talk about cause and effect. So you could be like, because the Pope was backing the Spanish crown's expeditions, that meant they needed to convert as many people as possible to make sure that he was like proud of them, right? You could use change over time. You could be like, well, originally at the beginning of this time period, like they were dealing with the Aztec conquest and the Aztecs were coming in and conquering other places and using them for sacrifice. But eventually that was replaced by the Europeans coming in and doing the same thing. You can use any reasoning skill you want. And you can mix them all up. You don't have to be explicit about it. It's just saying like, you're going to make an argument. You would be really surprised at how many people turn in an LEQ that is just a list of facts. So reasoning just means, can you put your facts together into like an argument? There are so many people that will literally just be like, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He was a Christian. When he arrived, there were indigenous people. They were not Christians. The Pope wanted there to be more Christians. Eventually the people became Christians. They lived in missions. They were forced to convert. And it's like literally just listing facts. Reasoning just means, can you put them together in a way that makes sense? That's all. The LEQ is very easy. Don't overthink it. Obviously, maybe you'd want to go back and add context. Great. Actually, the one about the Aztecs would be banging context. So remember, context can be from previously in time, or it can be something else happening at the same time. So for context, you could talk about, hey, this region was very familiar with conquest and was very familiar with authoritarian religions, right? They had the Aztecs and the Inca who were creating these massive empires and bringing people for human sacrifice. So this actually wasn't new, but Christianity coming over is going to be new. For context, you could also talk about, this is where you could kind of talk about something else that's going on somewhere else in the world that impacts this. So it could be like the age of exploration and the rise of Europe. So the idea that like Europe is starting to venture out and interact more with the Indian Ocean world, the New World, whatever. And so different religions are clashing and coming into contact with each other, whatever. Okay, so that's the LEQ. All right. Now let's talk about the DBQ, and I'm going to do it really quickly. I've literally written 2 full DBQs live on this channel. You can go watch me write an entire DBQ if you really want to see how this works. I just want to make it really clear what points I think we should and shouldn't be going for on the DBQ. So again, I want you to notice this looks the same as an LEQ. Do not overthink it. The 2 essays are the same. The only difference is where's your evidence coming from. The only difference is the LEQ, you have to come up with evidence on your own. And then the DBQ, you're using the evidence from the documents. Still, context and thesis gets you 2 points right there. Out of 7 points for the DBQ, you're shooting for, if you get a 4 or a 5, that's really good. And you get 2 points just for context and thesis. You don't have to understand a single document and you can still get 2 points. So just keep that in mind. Okay, then you're gonna have probably 2 or 3 body paragraphs. You're gonna have a topic sentence. That's gonna be kind of like your group of how you sort of like are making sense of this. Keep in mind, you can have a paragraph that just talks about one document. That's fine. Like, it really doesn't matter. In theory, you could have 7 separate paragraphs talking about each of the documents separately. You don't have to group the documents. It's just best practice. Like, it's better and it's easier, but you don't actually have to. So if you're panicking and you can't think of a group and you're like, I don't know where this one goes, just talk about it on its own. It doesn't have to be lumped in with a group if you can't force it, right? Okay. You get another point for literally just addressing 3 documents. And I'm going to show you what I mean. And I hope all of us will like calm down and feel a little more confident after I explain this to you, right? So this DBQ evaluate the extent to which European imperialism affected economies in Africa and Asia in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, let's say you're like, oh gosh, I don't know. I'm going to just say it was bad. European imperialism was bad for the local economies of these places because they got colonized and taken over. Maybe that's going to be your argument, whatever. Okay. Let's say you get to this first document. Again, read the source information word for word, read any notes word for word, and then skim the document just hunting for evidence. So what I'm doing, people have been asking for tips on like how to get through the documents quickly. You want to kind of identify keywords from the prompt. So we're looking for stuff that's talking about European imperialism and the economies of these places. So I'm literally just hunting for keywords that relate either to imperialism or the economies of these places. So I'm going to read the source information word for word. T.G. Edwards, manager of a government-run sugar factory. Great, that's already economics factory, and it's run by the government. In Dutch East Indies, letter to the Dutch colonial government. So already, without even reading the document, we have evidence. The Dutch are governing this place, and they're running a factory. You could literally use that. Like, you could literally use that as part of your answer. You can just be like, one impact was that local, businesses got taken over by colonial governments. For example, in the Dutch East Indies, sugar factories were run by the Dutch government. Document 1. And you didn't even read document 1. Now you should read it, but just, this is where if you're panicking, right? I mean, you can get a ton of information from the source information. Okay. Now you skim through looking for evidence of economy stuff, imperialism stuff, right? So unfortunately, many of the workers are already forced to work under the Dutch government's cultivation system. Basically, the workers are really busy from the government or from local elites. basically, if you're a worker, you have like 3 or 4 bosses. Sometimes you're being pulled to work for the Dutch government. Sometimes you're being pulled to work for a local elite. It's sort of chaos. Okay, so now the impact was bad for workers. That's your answer for this document. You're like, hey, the impact of imperialism on the economies in Africa and Asia was really bad for like the lower classes. For example, many workers were now not just working essentially slave labor for local elites, but they were also having to commit time and energy and resources to new colonial endeavors as well. Document 1, and then you move on. You don't need to understand every part of a document. You just need to understand enough of it to make an argument out of it. Okay, for time, I just want to make sure we're really clear. If you literally just describe that document, if you literally were just like, document 1 is explaining how workers often have to work not just for local elites, but they also have to work for the colonial government. If that's all you can get out of it, that's do that, because it'll at least get you 1 point. If you literally like describe 3 documents, you get a point. So guess what? Context, thesis, describe 3 documents, you already have a 3 out of 7. The national average on the DBQ is a 2. So don't worry, don't worry so much about complexity, right? I mean, there's so many easy points to be had. Now, ideally, you want to use 6 documents because you can get an additional point. So then you can be up to a 4, right? And then I think after that, so I think you get your basic essay down. You can go watch my strategy if you go watch me. Go to my YouTube channel and just search Emily Writes a DBQ, and you'll see I've done 2 or 3 that you can watch, and you'll see this whole strategy. But basically, I would get your basic essay down first, and then see how much time you have left, and then go, okay, can I think of my own evidence? Okay, should I evaluate the document? That sort of thing. Again, I have entire videos that are like how to source the documents, how to HIP them, analyze point of view, whatever. So if you want to deep dive into that, I would go watch those videos. I do want to make sure we get a chance to talk about all the content too. Okay. I'm going to skim through these questions. My prediction for this year's DBQ, I posted in my Instagram. I'm just noticing they have not done a Unit 8 DBQ in like 5 years since the course was redesigned. So my prediction is Unit 8, but I don't know. I could be wrong. Okay. All right. Oh my gosh, the College Board is here. Hi, College Board, and you're welcome. Okay. So let's see. Okay, can I predict what I would go over for my DBQ predictions? I'll do that on my Instagram and TikTok later. I'll do like a little outline of like, okay, let's say it's the DBQ I think it's going to be. I'll do a little TikTok on that later. What I want to do now is I want to get to content, because like that's probably why a lot of us are here. So, okay. Deep breath. Actually, I'm going to drink some water. Hydration is important. Okay. The best thing you can do for yourself between now and Thursday is this page. Genuinely, it's going to be the most useful thing, is just making sure you have the 4 eras straight. It is not in your best interest to make 50,000 flashcards and memorize the causes of the English Civil War between now and Thursday. I promise. It's way more in your best interest to just go, what era was the English Civil War in? Oh, it was in like the 1600s. So it's going to be here, gunpowder empires and stuff. Okay, cool. That's way better. Basically sorting. Like when I would have my students literally, like we do a whole activity of literally just sorting terms into the right era. It was like one of the most useful things they could do. So there's a few ways, but this is kind of a straight memorization thing. This to me is like the AP World History equivalent of a formula, like having formulas, having a little note card with formulas on it. If you can just kind of memorize the 4 eras and some like key events or key ideas from each era to like get your mind going, it's so helpful. Because think about on the that LEQ, that was like 1450 to 1750 religious change. Notice that at first I was like, what are we talking about? Oh, right, 1492, it's exactly what I did. I went 1492 is Columbus, right, so we're in exploration, and right, we're also in gunpowder empires. Literally just like getting my head straight in the right era. So I have this little graphic that I'll also share on my Instagram, but I also included basically some events that I find really useful to just kind of memorize. Not necessarily the exact year, But I want us to notice, like, I don't know if you've ever learned about or thought about why the College Board chose these years. Why did they choose 1200 to be the beginning of an era? Why 1450? Well, it's kind of because of these types of events. So if you can kind of remember that, hey, in the early 1200s was when Genghis Khan rose up, and it's also when the Magna Carta was signed. And I think it's also when the Aztecs started rising. That gives you a lot of hints to like what this era is. You're like, oh, right, it's the Mongols. Okay, the Mongols. Oh, right, they were in China. Oh, yeah, China was doing stuff. Oh, right, the Mongols over, oh, the Islamic world. I forgot about that. Like it just sparks your memory of other things. Okay, so 1200 to 1450 is called post-classical, trade routes, isolated, America's over here, Afro-Eurasia over here. We have powerful states. They are innovating technology mostly that helps with trade. Okay, that's 1200 to 1450. So if you in your head by Thursday can just go 1200 to 1450 and be like, right, trade routes, Silk Road, Dar al-Islam, Song, medieval Europe, great. And literally when the test starts on your scratch paper, as soon as they say you can begin, you could just make a quick little timeline, like a really quick one, so that as you're jumping across the exam from time to time, you can come back and kind of situate yourself and be like, oh, right, that's what we're talking about here. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give us 10 minutes for questions about 1200 to 1450. This is units 1 and 2. And then we'll move on. So 10 minutes, actually maybe like 5 minutes, because this is not on the exam that much. They don't really talk about this very much on the exam. I saw someone in the chat earlier on asked about the collapse of feudalism. So let me pull up, I had a map. On my Instagram just recently, I posted this too. This is like the whole course in basically 6 thesis statements. So from 1200 to 1450, we're saying powerful states expanded regional trade routes, period. That's what's happening in this era. Powerful states are expanding trade routes. Okay. So let's look at this map. These all come from my review packet, by the way, which you can buy on my website, or you can just use what I use here. Okay. So what is happening during this era is it's the golden age of these massive African and Asian, basically trading states, China, Dar al-Islam, Mali, and it's the end of the Middle Ages, the medieval era in Europe. So someone asked about the collapse of feudalism. Basically as Europe gets more incorporated back into Afro-Eurasia, thanks partly to the Mongols, right? As they start to get new technology in from China, as they start to develop like more printing, as they start to venture beyond their territories, maybe that's to crusade, or maybe it's for trade, maybe it's Marco Polo going somewhere. Basically, those things are going to lead to the breakdown of the feudal system, because the feudal system only works if you're like isolated on your own little manor, right? All of a sudden, if you're a serf, but there's like job openings in the city, then you're going to leave. Yeah, you're leaving your ancestral home, but you might leave and just go to the city and be like, screw you, I'm not going to be a serf anymore, right? By the way, there's like a lot of parallels between COVID and what happened with COVID, because a lot of people like didn't have to go into the office all the time, and they're like, wait, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm actually going to change my whole life around. I'm going to do something totally different. It's essentially what happens with the decline of feudalism. You have the Black Death come in and kill up to like 1/3 of everyone in Europe. There's a crisis of faith. Everyone has an existential crisis. They're like, oh my gosh, I might die. Like, what do I care about staying on my farm? Why don't I just go to the city? Why don't I go see the world, right? Workers become more valuable as people die off, frankly. And so all of a sudden that system starts to fall apart. It also is falling apart because kings and queens kind of want it to fall apart. And by that, I mean, kings and queens are rising up and they want to be more powerful than local nobles. So they're already starting to be like, what if I could get, instead of this guy having a bunch of serfs, what if instead they were all my people and they all kind of served me? So that's already sort of starting as well. Okay. Other questions about this era, 1200 to 1450. Oh yeah, I'm sure that, let me see. Explain the Magna Carta. King John signed it for the nobles, said, I don't have the right to just take money from you whenever I want, because you have some rights. That was it. But it was like the first written document being like, hey, people have some rights. So it's kind of the beginning for England of like the king having to share power with the nobles, even though like he kind of ignores it, but it's like a precedent sort of thing. Okay. Let me see. Oh, by the way, if that is the College Board's account and they're giving you an LEQ about the Cold War and the US economy, that's not AP World. That would be an APUSH question, so don't worry about it. Can you talk about Dar al-Islam? Yes, basically just as a euphemism for the Islamic world. It essentially just means that like Islam expands, it becomes incredibly powerful. It directly, like the Abbasid Caliphate at their height, directly controls all this land, but then indirectly, right, you have other Islamic states all around the world. Even Srivijaya and Majapahit become partly Islamic. And so essentially it just means that they kind of create their own Pax Mongolica. If you think about the impact of the Mongol Empire conquering and uniting all these trade routes and traders together, that's also what Dar al-Islam did. If you are a Muslim, you now have the whole Muslim world to trade with. You have kind of the same rules because you're following the Quran. You understand kind of each other's language because you probably are speaking Arabic, the language of the Quran, right? You have maybe trading benefits that non-Muslims don't have. So essentially, it just fosters, and that's partly because Islam is the most supportive of traders. Most other civilizations during this time think traders are like the lowest of the low. What do you even do? You don't grow anything. You don't make anything. You literally just like buy and sell stuff for other people. They're seen as not valuable. In Islam, they're seen as very valuable, partly because Muhammad himself was a trader. He was a merchant on a caravan, right? And so they're actively like, no, we want, because we understand, like if we spread you out to trade, you're also spreading Islam. You're also like spreading our influence. So again, Dar al-Islam being sort of united under Islam, even if they were different governments, is another really important thing. It has the same impact on trade that the Mongol Empire has. Let me see. How do I do well when I know most content about WAP except the French and British conflicts and the treaties it signed? Great, because that's AP Euro anyway. A lot of you are asking me questions that are European history. Like you're asking about the 7 Years' War. Don't worry about it. World War, French and Indian War in the United States, but otherwise don't worry about it, right? Like you're getting really stressed about like Napoleon. Napoleon is literally not in the curriculum for this course. We don't have to talk about him at all, right? The French Revolution is inspired by the American Revolution, but the point is, if there's a topic that is really only about Europe, it doesn't impact other parts of the world, then like you don't need to worry about it. That's an AP Euro problem. Okay. Let's see. House of Wisdom, Baghdad. That's a great like illustrative example that shows up a lot, right? It's a really good example of the Islamic world being really supportive of trade and new ideas and scholars. There was a sultan who literally like created this massive library in Baghdad and invited scholars from all over the world. They're translating ancient Greek, Roman, Indian texts. They're inventing algebra, lots of stuff, right? So again, this time period is about who is sponsoring and promoting innovation and who's not. So China, India, the Islamic world, West Africa, they're sponsoring and promoting innovation and they're thriving. Europe, the Catholic Church, is not, and they're struggling, right? And again, that matters to us because it leads directly into the next era. Why did Europe feel like they needed to sail off into the unknown ocean? Because they were freaking desperate, not because they were brave, they were desperate. Right? They were coming out of their dark ages and realizing, oh my gosh, these other empires have been doing this for so long and they've been crushing it. How are we ever going to get in on this trade thing? We're so far behind. They got desperate. That's what the age of exploration was. They just got really lucky, right? Okay. Let's see. Yeah, y'all ignore the College Board official account. They're not going to leak an LEQ. And the LEQ they said was literally a US history LEQ. Okay. Zheng He, it looks like Zhang He, but Zheng He was a Chinese, he was actually a Muslim explorer for China during the Ming Dynasty. He went out kind of as a show of the power of China. Basically, when the Ming Dynasty took back China from the Mongols, they wanted to be like, hey, we're back, we're China, everyone remember that we're here, right? And so Zheng He was sent out with these massive treasure fleet ships all around the Indian Ocean world. It wasn't like an age of exploration thing. They weren't trying to find new lands. They were trying to like establish themselves as the main power in the Indian Ocean. Okay, let's see. All right. Okay, let's just move on to the next era because this era is not on the test very much. Okay, so let's go back to our overview. So this next era, 1450 to 1750, shows up a ton on the exam. Okay, We are basically talking about gunpowder empires in the age of exploration. Again, that's something I would just memorize. When you see the years 1450 to 1750, I would memorize gunpowder empires, age of exploration. If you want dates, well, 1450, 1453 is when the Ottomans conquer Constantinople using guns and cannons, gunpowder empires. And of course, in 1492 is Columbus's voyage. So those are just two events that help spark your memory of like, right, that's what these two eras are about. Okay, the big theme for 1450 to 1750 is basically rising European maritime empires are competing with Asian and African states. So what we're essentially seeing is we have these really powerful African and Asian trading states that are still crushing it. We have Europe coming out of their dark ages and they're like the dark horse rising. And we're at the moment right around here where they're meeting. Europe is not on top. Europe is not better or stronger than Asia and even a lot of like East African, even some West African kingdoms. They're not. They are able to conquer and dominate the Americas, but not the old world, right? This is when they're just kind of rising. The next era is when they will like conquer. So if we look at this map, 1450 to 1750, we're talking about the major gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, Safavid, Mughal, Ming, Russia too. One thing just to notice is that almost all of these gunpowder empires are rising out of the ashes of the Mongol Empire. That's the lasting impact of the Mongols, that all the places they conquered, remember, they helped diffuse technology from China, specifically gunpowder, and the Mongols invented the cannon, or they had people invent the cannon for them. And so all these places that are the first to adopt gunpowder and start to have whole regiments that are like armed with guns are all the places that were conquered by the Mongols. That's cause and effect, right? Okay. So there's no getting through these gunpowder empires. If you're Europe, remember, your goal is still to get to the Indian Ocean. This is where it's at. This is where all the money is in the Indian Ocean world. So if you're England or France or Portugal or Spain, let's say Portugal and Spain, because they're the big guys in this era, you can't go this way. You can't. Like, first of all, it's a bunch of Muslim empires that hate you because, especially if you're Spain, you just did your like Reconquista and killed a bunch of Muslims. And also, it's not that long since the Crusades. So they're all like, no, thank you. Right. So you can't go that way, really. So where else are you going to go? Well, Portugal gets in on it first and they're like, let's start seeing if we can go around Africa. And then eventually they do. And then they've kind of taken that route. So then Spain's like, oh, damn it. No, we got to do something else. And so again, Spain's like, I don't know, let's just throw Columbus this way and see what happens. And of course, we know what happens, right? So again, the age of exploration is directly connected to the gunpowder empires because those gunpowder empires were so strong that there wasn't any other way for the Europeans to get to China, to get to India, the Indian Ocean, besides finding another route. Okay, so that's the big picture of how they're connected. Let me look at questions from this era. Okay. Portuguese and the Indian Ocean trade. That was the topic of the DBQ a few years ago. Basically, the Portuguese just arrived. They're the first Europeans to kind of arrive on the scene of the Indian Ocean, but they do not dramatically transform the Indian Ocean. That was actually the big takeaway for that DBQ is like, hey, Indian Ocean has been thriving for a very long time. The Portuguese showed up and they're like one more player, but it's still mostly dominated by Muslims, by Indians, by the Chinese. Like the Portuguese just show up and are there and they're kind of the new guy and people are looking at them with suspicion, but the Portuguese are creating a trading post empire. They're just trying to gain influence in cities. They're not grabbing land. So in this era, the Portuguese and then even eventually the Spanish and the Dutch don't have like a massive impact on the Indian Ocean, except over here, of course, the East Indies get kind of fully taken over by first the Portuguese, then the Dutch. But we're on mainland, like China, India, Middle East, not a big impact at all. The biggest impact is just that the Americas gives Spain mostly and Portugal stuff that the Indian Ocean doesn't have, right? Remember from 1200 to 1450, think about all the trading routes and all the things that were traded. Everything that you wanted came out of the Indian Ocean world. Like, what did Europe have to compete? They're like, oh, we have wool. And the Chinese are like, we have freaking silk. Like, we don't need your wool. I mean, literally, right? They're like, we have turnips. And they're like, we have every spice you could ever think of. So the discovery of the Americas is really important because all of a sudden they discover silver, like insane quantities of silver in Mexico and Peru. that are still, those mines are still working to this day. That's how much silver is there. Before this era, the only source of silver in the entire world was Japan. So it was like this super premium special thing that like no one had access to, more precious than gold, anything else. And all of a sudden, the Spanish literally discover like a gold mine, right? They discover a silver mine, and now they can pay for things in silver. They don't have like goods and stuff yet that other people want, but they can get involved in the trade because they have all the silver that the rest of the world thinks is really shiny and cool, basically. Okay. Mughal taxes. Oh, right. Okay. So the other thing that's happening during this era is that back in the Afro-Eurasia, kind of in the quote unquote old world, rulers are using a lot of different strategies to like consolidate their power. And they're basically using the military. So gunpowder empires, they're having like, we're having the first standing armies of all ever. We've, in the modern era, maybe since the Romans, but like we haven't had standing militaries since 1200. That has not existed. If you needed a military, you like called everyone up. You basically had a national guard. You had like volunteers. The Ottomans are the first to have a regular standing military with their janissaries, meaning just professional soldiers, that that's all they do. This is the first time in modern world history that that's happened. So that's a way that they're consolidating control. The Sultan is, right? He has his own army for him. It's not his local elite sending men, it's his own, right? You also have administrative tactics. So keep in mind that these empires are so much bigger than the states before them were, besides the Mongols, right? And so all of a sudden it becomes a lot more complicated. Like if you're the Ottoman ruler in Constantinople, like how do you administer this? And so we have a lot of more elaborate tax systems. So we have Ottoman tax farming. I don't understand it. I just know it's a thing. We have Mughal zamindars, which are basically local elites that get like empowered to be like, you collect taxes on my behalf. And if you want to skim off the top, that's fine, right? Just keep the locals in line and then pay me the taxes I need. Over in Europe, you have the British are establishing, the king is establishing like justices of the peace. Basically, instead of the feudal kind of medieval, like, okay, everything's just going to be dealt with in your local community by your local priest or whatever. No. Now it's like an administrator of the king, right? In France, you had something similar. It's called the intendant system. So they're just having different ways to basically, Spain is doing it too. Spain is sending like viceroys and other people. It's essentially creating bureaucracy, creating bureaucracy in ways to like get taxes and goods from the places we need and then administer laws and rules onto them. And so they're developing these middlemen and wanting to make sure that they are loyal to the ruler, not loyal to like their local communities or their local elites. That Japan is doing the same thing. They're going to do it with the shogun and alternate attendants. Basically, like if you're a noble, you have to live every other year in the court in essentially Tokyo, and it's a power move. Same like Louis XIV builds Versailles, and it's like, you're all going to live with me. It's a power move. I'm going to take you out of your community where you're the lord, you're the elite, and you're going to be with me, and you're going to serve me. Okay, what else? Any other questions? 1450 to 1750. Were the Janissaries slaves? Yes, the Janissaries are enslaved. Originally, they were taken from conquered Christian communities in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. So this is a form of slavery. It's essentially like, but it's not slavery like we're seeing it develop in the New World, because they're seen as people. They're allowed to like marry, advance, whatever. But essentially, they just like cannot choose their job. That's essentially what it is. If you become a Janissary, you're going to go into these elite schools to learn. If you're really smart, you're going to become an administrator of the empire. And if you're really like strong, you're going to become a Janissary soldier, basically. Okay. Okay. What was the outcome of the Crusades? Middle East stayed Islamic. That was the outcome, right? I love how everyone is like obsessed about this LEQ prediction. I don't have LEQ predictions, but I agree with Freeman. I think unit 3 is a big one. Unit 5 and unit 8 are the 3 units that haven't shown up as much. And that's what I would suggest studying the most, right? Okay. Janissaries are the people. The system is called Devshirme. So that might be what you're thinking of. Okay. Okay, yes, I'll explain the British East India Company in the next era in just a second. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Anything else from 1450 to 1750 that we didn't talk about? I feel like there was one thing that I wanted to say, and now I can't remember what it is. So it's rulers consolidating power in different ways, taxes, militaries, administration, whatever. And it's the rise of sea-based empires. In this era, we're talking about the Spanish and the Portuguese. They're the big guys in Europe in this era. Spain is like the most powerful kingdom in Europe for like 500 years, right? Britain is rising, but notice like they don't have a lot of land. They like start at towards the end of this era, they have the American colonies, but that's about it, right? It's Portugal and Spain, and then it's kind of the Dutch in South Africa and in Southeast Asia. Next era, it's the British Empire. Next era is like the massive British Empire where the sun never sets. Okay, let's move to 1750 to 1900. So going back, this era is revolutions and imperialism. That's all it is. It's actually pretty simple, right? Keep in mind, revolutions includes the Industrial Revolution. So again, a few dates that might help you situate your brain. 1768 is when the steam engine was invented. 1776, the Declaration of Independence will help you kind of remember basically Unit 5, which is like industrialization and political revolutions. And then this era is kind of divided into two a little bit, because it's like 1750s, 60s, 70s, 80s is like industrialization and the political revolutions. And then kind of the second half of this era, the mid to late 1800s, is really more the age of imperialism, right? And resistance to imperialism. So like in the 1850s is when the Sepoy Rebellion hits India. In 1884 is when there's that Berlin Conference to scramble up Africa. So again, this era can kind of be divided into two. This era is a lot about change over time. So think about the beginning of this era, 1750, is so different than the end of it, 1900, right? Okay, what questions do y'all have about 1750 to 1900? Let me see. I'm gonna drink some more water. Yeah, everyone ignore the College Board channel. They're saying they're fake, like ignore them, okay. It's 100% not real. Everyone leave it alone. Okay. The Sepoy Rebellion was basically, oh, someone asked about the British East India Company, and that relates to this. So let's talk about the British East India Company. So, sorry. Okay, 1750 to 1900 is when we're starting to see the rise of Britain as a major world power. Most of how they're rising, though, is not through direct conquest. The Spanish did like direct conquest. We claim Mexico for the king. We claim South America for the king. Portugal, in the last year, I was doing like trading posts. We are going to hold influence in these trading cities, but we don't want to have to govern anyone. The British kind of took that model. They sort of took the trading post model instead and said, you know what? Like, what we're going to do is we're going to encourage capitalism. So Queen Elizabeth was like, it's actually way more cost effective if I just allow these explorers and these business people, if I just allow them to go explore and claim whatever they want for me, and then they just pay me a little bit of whatever they find or whatever they earn. So she's starting essentially, this is like those charters, the Virginia Company charter that founded Jamestown, whatever. It's kind of a little bit more of a capitalist approach to colonization, where it's like, so the British East India Company was a company, but it was sanctioned by the crown, but it was technically like a private company that was just going around and claiming trade routes. They're the bad guys in the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, right? Like they're going around and claiming trade routes. They're bullying people on the ocean to be like, we're here now, right? They're essentially pirates that are flying the British flag, and they're going around and claiming land and making trade deals, and they're kind of doing it on their own. They don't have to go back and check with the king or queen every time. They're doing it on their own, but then whatever money they make, they have to pay a certain amount to the crown. So it's just different than the Spanish, right? The Spanish don't create private companies. They're like, no, this is just us. And it's really the difference between like absolute monarchy and kind of a constitutional monarchy. So England, going all the way back to the Magna Carta, was on this little different path, but they're like, maybe some people maybe sometimes have rights that the king can't take away. And then that escalated at, just before this era, the English Civil War, right? They literally executed King Charles the First. Every King Charles, by the way, has not had a good time in power. I'm not really sure why Charles didn't change his name, but anyway, they literally the Parliament executed the King of England in the English Civil War in the 1600s because he was not respecting their rights as Parliament. So I don't know why we don't talk about that in the context of like the Atlantic revolutions, right? Because that sets a precedent. But so again, this idea that like, maybe people have power, maybe people can have their own money, can make their own way. That's sort of an English thing that we then get the United States as well. And it basically just sets us up to be able to maneuver more quickly in this like global economy, whether that's like trading companies or eventually the rise of our big economies and then like corporations and whatever. Okay. So the Sepoy Rebellion is the British East India Company had control of a lot of land in India. They just straight up controlled it. Think about like the US, like United Fruit Company that controlled a lot of land in Central America. It's the same idea. They hired Indian soldiers to protect them and their land, called sepoys. These are Indian soldiers hired by the British East India Company. Those soldiers eventually rebelled because they were like, this company's getting too powerful. There were lots of different reasons. It basically became like a statewide Indian rebellion against the British East India Company. It's called the Sepoy Rebellion because that's kind of who started it, but it essentially like the Mughal emperor gets involved too. And they try to kick the company out. They have the opposite effect because it pisses off the, I guess, King of England, or maybe Queen Victoria, maybe it's Queen, so much that they're like, fine, we'll just take direct control of India. Right. So it's a little bit of it changes the course of Indian history because India was still technically independent. There was the Maratha and the Mughal kingdom and different kingdoms, and this British company was just there. But as they got more influential, they fought back, and the British responded with like, well, this is why we can't have nice things. We're now going to send a government to like govern you. And they create the British Raj. This is when India gets like colonized by the British officially. There's other rebellions too. In China, we have like the Taiping Rebellion, which is a massive rebellion trying to basically overthrow the emperor, but it fails. Again, later on, the Chinese emperor has this like Boxer Rebellion that tries to kick European traders out of the cities, but it fails. So notice that the tides have changed, and what were these really hugely powerful gunpowder empires, the Lost Era, are struggling against these smaller, like England, with their huge British Empire. The Ottoman Empire is still trucking along, but they're kind of struggling by the mid to late 1800s. They're losing a lot of land. They're known as kind of the sick man of Europe. And then, of course, in Africa, this is when Africa gets fully colonized. So in the last era, we mostly were talking about trade deals with African kingdoms and like trading posts along the coast. With industrialization now, we can go fully into the interior and like colonize and take over the entire continent. Now that we have steamboats that can go upriver into, interior Africa, or now that we have machine guns and that sort of thing. And so basically industrialization, just like in the last era, gunpowder was the thing that allowed a state to become incredibly big and powerful. In this era, it's industrial technology. If you have industrialization, you have steamboats, you have machine guns, you have steam engines, eventually trains, telegraphs. That's going to be the thing that allows you to become a big, massive empire. So we see the British rise up. We're going to see the United States rise up as a big, massive empire in this time. That's what Manifest Destiny was. Remember that painting of the lady and she's carrying a telegraph wire and there's like a train below her? Like that's what that is, right? And the states that were not industrializing, like China, for example, are going to really struggle. Okay. Skim through for questions. Wait, Heimler's here. Hi, Steve. I'm going to be on Heimler's reviews the next 3 nights too, by the way. So if hopefully you're going to join Heimler's reviews on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night on his page, and I'll pop in every once in a while to teach some stuff, and everyone will go, who's this lady? We want Steve, and it'll be fine. Okay. Okay. Can I explain the importance of the Latin American revolutions? Yeah, let's talk about the revolutions really quick. You don't need to know the details of all the revolutions. You don't need to know exactly all the ins and outs of the French Revolution and when was the Reign of Terror and then when did Napoleon rise, whatever. You just want to know really big picture, what kind of started it, and then what's the outcome. So of course, the American Revolution, well, English Civil War, I think is the first, but that's in the last time period. American Revolution is the first. Really big deal. We get rid of a king. We become the first modern essentially democracy that doesn't have a king. It's a really big deal, even though, yes, of course, only for white men who own property, but still, it was a really big deal. We sort of started to put into play these Enlightenment ideas. A lot of people have been theorizing, like maybe just random dudes could rule themselves. And the American Revolution is the first time that we're like, yeah, a bunch of random dudes named George and John are gonna maybe rule themselves, and no one's ordained by God. And that was weird. I mean, think about in the context of world history how weird that is, right? So it inspires other revolutions. So it kind of directly leads to the French Revolution, for one, because France was in a lot of debt, because they gave us like millions and millions and millions of dollars essentially for our own revolution. Sorry. And so, the French Revolution is almost directly caused by this. It's Enlightenment. You have Lafayette, who literally like fought with George Washington and Alexander Hamilton in the Revolution. And he goes back to France and writes the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He's like besties with Thomas Jefferson, who like helps him write it, right? People think it's plagiarized. No, Thomas Jefferson just helped write that document. And then it sparks this massive revolution. But what happens with most revolutions is that the first step is easy. It's actually pretty easy to get rid of a leader. It's a lot harder to decide what's our government going to be now. Like, what are we going to build now? Imagine the Hunger Games, right? Okay, you get rid of Snow. What next? Are we just going to have Coin rise up and be a Napoleon? I don't know. Or are we going to try to do some new democratic thing and have the other lady who becomes the president, commander, whatever? That's the point. The French Revolution is important because it directly leads to all of the revolutions in the rest of the Americas. And let me explain to you how. When France starts having essentially a civil war, which is essentially what the French Revolution is, their island colony of Haiti was like, hey, they seem distracted over there. Maybe we should like govern ourselves. And so the white people on the island are like fighting amongst themselves because of kind of mimicking essentially the revolution. Like, what are we going to be? Meanwhile, all the enslaved Black people who outnumbered the white people 10-1 were like, everyone seems really distracted. Like, I kind of think we should just rebel and kick them all out. That's what the Haitian Revolution was. Toussaint Louverture, incredible leader, rose up. And it was basically because of the chaos of the French Revolution that they were able to do that. It's a French colony. They were like, no one's paying attention to us right now. Let's just do it, right? Okay. The French Revolution ends with Napoleon. Napoleon comes in and establishes himself as a dictator and an emperor, and then he Napoleons all over Europe. He basically tries to recreate like a Roman Empire all over Europe. And the thing that we care about, everything else is European history. The thing we care about is that he conquered Spain and he put the King of Spain in prison, put his brother on the throne. So the King of Spain is in prison. So all of a sudden, all of New Spain is like, what do we do? Our king's in prison and he's the one that directly controls all of us and makes all of the decisions. So what should we do? They start to form juntas, military governments. They're like, this is a crisis. We're going to need to kind of govern ourselves for a while because the King of Spain is being imprisoned by Napoleon. So they form these little governments. And then when Napoleon goes away and the King of Spain comes back out and he's like, I'm back, give me back all the power. Across Latin America, they're like, actually, it was kind of nice. We like kind of liked governing ourselves, right? So that's where you have like Simon Bolivar. You have who's like Gran Colombia, like, actually, I kind of think we can do this without you because we kind of ruled ourselves without you for a while there when you were in prison, right? And some of the revolutions are for different things. Mexico was started by peasants and indigenous people, and then it was taken over by Creoles, right? The kind of Spanish descended people that are now born and raised in the Americas. But the point is that the chaos in Europe is what allowed almost all of Latin America to rebel and to not have their like empires immediately come in with their militaries and like put it down. Partly too, because Europe is really focusing way more over here. They're really focusing on the Indian Ocean. I mean, even with the American Revolution, at some point the British just gave up and they're like, oh, we're going to take India anyway. Who cares? Right? At some point they just gave up. Okay, I think that's everything. Lola Rodriguez de Tio in Puerto Rico, please. Yes. Okay, I saw that one. So one thing to note about this era when we're talking about imperialism, I see a lot of you being like, please talk about Unit 6. Let's talk about Unit 6. So that's what's going on in the Americas. What's going on in Africa and Asia is just direct imperialism kind of for the first time. So even the era before, it was a lot of like the Portuguese allying with African states. If you've seen like The Woman King with Viola Davis, you can kind of see that they're not like conquered and colonized entirely at that point. They're still kind of negotiating. Industrialization allows for the continent of Africa to be essentially all colonized except for Egypt and Ethiopia and Liberia. And then same thing here over in Asia. They're not all explicitly conquered, like in China, right? You have the Opium Wars, and then the British and other states basically just kind of like take power in the cities where they can trade. They tried to do the same thing in India, right? But the Sepoy Rebellion made them step in even further. So you don't need to worry so much about all the different types of imperialism. Like you don't need to memorize like a settler colony versus a whatever colony. You just want to understand that there's different ways to imperialize, basically. Like it's not all just like our military's here, we're conquering you. That's one way to build an empire. There's also economic imperialism, like the spheres of influence in China. The United States is the best at economic imperialism. Even as the Latin American countries are becoming independent, we're already going, hey, and you want to listen to us, right? Like we all want to be in a sphere. Like Monroe has this like Monroe doctrine, like Europe, stay out of the Americas because we want it, right? We're manifesting our destiny and fighting a war against Mexico because Texas did a thing, right? That's all in the context of this, where it's like we are building an empire. We're just annexing them as states. But if you ask the indigenous and the Mexican people of California if we were an empire or not, they're gonna be like, yeah, it was an empire. We were conquered, right? Yeah, we let them in as a state, but like still. Okay. So the other thing you want to think about is resistance to imperialism and all the different ways that basically whoever was there originally is resisting this. And so you want to just have a few examples. You don't need to know everything that happened. You might know a few examples of war, of people like just actually fighting wars. What I would suggest is know kind of one from each continent. So maybe over here you have like Tupac Amaru II, who was like led a rebellion against the Spanish in Peru. He's also the namesake of the rapper Tupac. Tupac's mom was a Black Panther and was like, I want to name my son after a man of color fighting against colonizers. So she named him Tupac Amaru Shakur. Anyway, that'll help you remember that. The Zulu Wars would be a good one in South Africa. Zulu fighting against the British encroaching. And Sepoy Rebellion is a great one for India. But then I would also know cultural resistance. So that's where you have, in Puerto Rico, you have sorry, I always get confused between, okay. So in Puerto Rico, you have a nationalism rising. So you have like Lola Rodriguez de Tio, who's a poet, a nationalist poet, and she's writing a lot of poetry being like, we should break away from the Spanish, blah, blah, blah. Of course, the War of 1898, it's like a lot of these places break away from the Spanish only to be immediately taken by the United States, right? You also have a similar thing in the Philippines. You have what's called the propaganda movement, where it's like these highly educated intellectual societies who are putting out pamphlets and propaganda about independence from Spain. Again, the US is supporting that and is like, yeah, fight for independence from Spain, and then we'll snatch you up, right? You also have cultural resistance in the form of like the ghost dance movement in South Africa too, which is like a religious form of resistance. They believed a prophecy that if they killed all the cattle, that it would like eradicate the Europeans. And it was this sort of mystical idea. It obviously fails. It's similar to like the ghost dance movement in the Great Plains in the United States. It was this kind of religious movement of like, of trying to like perform this ghost dance in a way that like the colonizers would leave and the buffalo would return. It fails, but still resistance. So again, you don't need to know every single one. You can just pick a few. Ya Ashantewa is an awesome badass warrior queen out of the Ashanti kingdom. She like leads war and fights the British for decades. So I would just know a few examples. So if there was an LEQ, for example, about imperialism or resistance to imperialism, you had enough that you could talk about. You have some examples of like military fighting, and you have some examples of non-military, like cultural resistance. That'd be great. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. So I want to get to the 20th century. And yeah, I'm not really gonna talk about the world wars at all, because I don't know, I'm gonna talk about Unit 8. I'm gonna talk about the Cold War. So let's go back really quickly. So our last era, there are years you need to know in this era. The College Board is just going to assume that you know these years. Actually, not all these. You need to know the years of World War I, the years of World War II, and when the Soviet Union collapsed. So the College Board, the 20th century is kind of the only era where sometimes they break it into even smaller sections where they might give you an LEQ that says like, or my DBQ prediction, which is evaluate the impact of the Cold War conflict on newly independent nations from 1945 to 1991. That means you can only talk about after World War II and during the Cold War while the Soviet Union still existed. Okay, so let's think about that prompt. And let's think about how the Cold War impacted this, because the world wars and stuff, like, y'all are fine. You know the world wars, it's okay. All right. This is our last map. Okay. So this is essentially what the Cold War world looked like, right? So out of the world wars, we have the collapse of imperialism. And so two things are happening. Out of World War II, we have two superpowers left, the US and the Soviet Union. And we call that a bipolar world. Literally, there's two poles, like, and because of that, we also have the collapse of all the other empires, the British, the French, whatever. So we have a wave of decolonization and new states being formed, but they're formed under the shadow of the Cold War. You have to understand the Cold War and decolonization go hand in hand and they're interconnected. They're not two separate events. So I want you to think about, let's think about a country like India, right? So let's say, okay, India, Gandhi, they push for independence. They peacefully are able to achieve independence. And then they partition, which is more violent, into India and East and West Pakistan. Okay, so let's say now you're India and you are newly independent. You're an independent nation for the first time in 100 years, and you're united for the first time ever. The borders of India don't really make sense. India is so diverse, right? But now they're India. Think about when the United States was formed. We had a lot of time to figure out what we wanted to be. I mean, you could argue that it wasn't until 100 years later with our Civil War that we like really kind of figured it out. We had a lot of time to try different things. Okay, maybe we should have a really small government. Maybe Andrew Jackson will be a huge government. Maybe we'll go back and forth. And we didn't really have a ton of input from the outside. Most people were ignoring us. That's what these decolonized states wanted. If you're India or you're some African country that's just become independent for the first time, you want to be left alone. You want to be able to make some mistakes. You want to be able to decide what kind of country you want to be, but you can't do that during the Cold War. So what happens is all these new countries basically emerge, and then immediately you have the Soviet Union and the United States staring at them being like, which side are you on? Don't choose wrong. If you choose wrong, you'll be our enemy forever. And so like immediately, African and Asian states are coming and they're brand new, but they're having to pick a side. And if they pick wrong, it could like ruin the next 60 years of their country's life, right? So some of the countries in yellow were part of the like non-aligned movement. They were attempting to band together and be like, what if we all support each other? What if, you know, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Egypt, a lot of these different places kind of supported each other and said, we're going to like protect each other from the big guys. It kind of worked, but it didn't quite work. But the idea is that the impact of the Cold War on this era is basically that everyone is forced to pick an extreme side, and there's no nuance. There's no real time for like experimentation in these new states. So even if you think about in Central America, right? So in some of these Central American countries, they were kind of newly independent a while ago, right? They were trying to figure out what their government was going to be. And a lot of governments in the 20th century in Latin America looked around and they were like half our land is controlled by US companies, like the United Fruit Company. That's not fair. That's what they said, right? And so you had a lot of leaders getting elected, democratically elected leaders who would say, when I get elected, we're going to redistribute the land. We're going to take the land that's owned by foreign companies, take it from them, nationalize it, and then we're going to distribute it out to peasants who don't have any land. Okay, well, they're an independent country. If we believe in sovereignty, then like they should be allowed to do that. But the United States was not going to let that happen, right? That seems communist-y, right? And that's bad for our businesses. So we would then go in and literally like assassinate leaders. We'd send the CIA and we'd help military groups fighting against them, so that we made sure that there was a government in power that liked us, that was going to like us and our business and our economy, and not maybe a more socialist, communist type. Same thing with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is going to invade like Afghanistan and be like, we want to make sure that you're a socialist, you remain, socialist, communist nation, whatever. So the big idea is just all these proxy wars and stuff, that it's happening at the same time as decolonization. So as soon as you become independent, like you have to make a choice that is going to stick with you for the next 50 years. And if you make the wrong choice, you might all of a sudden become assassinated. Imagine if we put it in the context of the American Revolution, imagine if as soon as America became independent, France and Spain were like, hi, which one of us are you choosing? And if you choose wrong, you might all die. And maybe we go, well, France, because we allied with France. And then Spain rolls in with their whole military and conquers us. And they assassinate George Washington. So we're not unified, whatever, right? There's chaos. That's essentially what's happening in a lot of African, Asian, Latin American countries. Okay. How did colonizers pull out of Africa? What made them decolonize? They were too weak to continue, essentially. So World War II. So two things. World War II just effectively made these European states way weaker. They were so destroyed. They had no money left. So they just couldn't afford to keep administering these empires. So they sort of allowed a lot of these states who'd been asking for independence for a long time to become independent. Sometimes they fought wars, but for the most part, they just kind of allowed it to happen. The other thing too, and this is going to be a weird way to say it, but like Hitler made imperialism look bad. So all of a sudden, if the US is trying to argue that we are the greatest nation on earth, and we and our allies in Western Europe are way more modern than those scary Soviets, we can't be openly for imperialism because that's a Nazi thing. You know what I mean? That's the other evil guy. So it's like all of a sudden we start in this Cold War world painting imperialism as a thing that like Nazis do and as a thing that like Soviets do. The Soviets are there with their wall, like holding on to East Germany. We're not. We're the good guys. So it becomes kind of part of that Cold War propaganda. Of course, we still have a massive empire, but it's like an indirect influence empire, right? And we still have Puerto Rico, which, we can talk about that later. But like the Philippines, we grant independence to the Philippines in 1945, that sort of thing. Let's see. I'm skimming through for any last big questions that I could answer. Well, everyone's asking what would be good outside evidence for a DBQ, and you can't know that because it just has to be evidence that's not in the documents they give you. So any of the things I just talked about could be outside evidence, assuming that there isn't a document about it, right? A proxy war is where two sides, like the US and the Soviets, don't want to fight each other directly because we have nuclear weapons and that's scary. So instead, we both back, if there's like a civil war going on in a country, we back the opposite sides and support them and hope that our side will win. And we'll have then more influence. So a proxy war is like, where we, for example, in Angola had a massive civil war and one side was like pro-Marxist communist and one side was not. So we supported the side that was not, the Soviets supported the side that was. And it was kind of like playing almost a game of chess, but with people's lives, right? Where then whoever wins, we gain more influence. We're trying to grab up as many basically countries as possible. Okay, Bandung Conference was a meeting in Indonesia of possible non-aligned movement. It's essentially just the meeting where Sukarno of Indonesia. I think I don't know if Indira Gandhi was there. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana is there. All these different states send representatives, and it's essentially a lot of these third world nations, which of course third world comes from the Cold War. In the Cold War, we named everything. So the first world was us and our allies. The second world was the Soviets and their allies. And then the third world was everywhere else where we're kind of fighting over. And so Bandung Conference was essentially them declaring, we're going to remain non-aligned, leave us alone. It kind of worked. It kind of didn't, I mean, we could still do whatever we wanted. It was them just kind of declaring that. Okay. What genocide should we know? What a dark but good question. The Holocaust, it's probably the only one that is like mandatory that will show up on the test. Unit 9, don't worry about it. Unit 9 is just globalization. How did technology improve? Globalization, transportation. How did our world become more global? Global problems, climate change, the UN, blah, blah, blah. I did 3 YouTube videos on Unit 9 because I think most teachers don't even really teach it or don't have you read your book about it. So you can always go watch those videos if you want an overview, right? Yeah, let's talk about Egypt. I'll do a few more and then we'll sign off. Egypt is a really interesting state that it could be helpful to know. Egypt had kind of in the 1800s broken away from the rest of the Ottoman Empire. So if you remember in the last era, there was a leader in Egypt named Muhammad Ali in the 1800s, not the boxer, a different guy. And he was like a big kind of nationalist. And he was like, hey, we're going to break away from the Ottomans. We're going to build up our own navy. We're going to kind of build ourselves as a state. They built the Suez Canal with help and investment from the English and the French. The problem was their economy collapsed because of our Cold War. We destroyed cotton prices. It was a whole thing. Their economy collapsed. So then they became really dependent on the English and the French. So they like moved away from the Ottoman Empire, but then they immediately got kind of taken over a little bit by the English and the French, who were using like economic imperialism on them. Okay. So now in this era, you have Egypt that's like technically independent, but basically has to do what the British/French want, most of the British. Then in the post-World War II era, they have a new nationalist leader that rises up named Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser is his last name, right? And he's a nationalist. He's a pan-Arab nationalist. He's like, hey, all these Arab countries need to unite together. And we need to unite together and like resist more US imperialism, more Western imperialism. So Nasser kind of loosely allies with the Soviet Union. He nationalizes the Suez Canal, which leads to a brief war with England. England like goes to war over the Suez Canal, and it's a disaster for England. It's kind of seen as like the sign that their empire is over, right? If you've watched The Crown, this is in the background of like season 2 of The Crown. So essentially, Nasser's just a really good example. In a lot of states, you have these nationalist heroes who are kind of fighting for like the people who've been oppressed and colonized. In that vein, you could see like Dr. King as our guy in the US. He's like fighting for Black people of color who've been kind of like second-class citizens enduring this sort of white supremacy. He's kind of our guy that's happening in this post-World War II era. You have Nasser. He's not the same as Dr. King. He's not this like peaceful whatever guy, but Nasser is kind of that icon for Egypt. You have Kwame Nkrumah for Ghana. You have Nelson Mandela for South Africa. You have Gandhi for India, right? So you're seeing a lot of figures rise, especially people of color, like resisting these like hundreds of years of kind of white supremacy and imperialism with different tactics. Some are using peaceful protests, some are using war, whatever. Okay. All right. We're going to stop there. I'm going to go onto my Instagram and I'm going to put a story right now where you can ask me more questions. So anything I didn't get a chance to talk about here, I want to remind you of a few things. I have so many YouTube videos on this channel. If you've not explored this channel, I have unit overviews for every single unit where I go over the big ideas and what might be talked about. I have deep dives into writing. So I have whole videos about thesis statements, about evidence. I have whole videos where I write SAQs and DBQs live in front of you. So there's a ton of resources on this YouTube channel to address some of the questions that maybe I didn't get a chance to answer or just go more in depth, right? Also, I'm going to be going live with Heimler tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And that's when we're going to really cover even more content. So, make sure, go to my Instagram. I'll put it up right when I sign off. Post any questions that I didn't get a chance to answer. I'll do my best to answer as many as possible between now and Thursday. Please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. Go check out my review packet. If you like the way I explain things, these maps and stuff are all from this review packet that you can still buy, could be useful for the next week. And I really appreciate y'all joining me. I really hope this was helpful. Good luck. Go find my Instagram story and let me know all the stuff I didn't answer for you yet.